December 1944. A Gestapo interrogation room in Krakow. The air is thick with the smell of cheap tobacco, dampness, and old fear. A dusty light bulb hanging from the ceiling casts harsh, painful shadows on the face of an elderly man sitting on a rickety chair. His name is Hans Wagner, and just a year ago, he was a senior engineer for the Imperial Railways. A man who knew the language of steel giants better than the language of men. Now, his face is like parchment on which exhaustion and torment have etched their script. His calloused hands, accustomed to the hot metal of the reverser and the cold steel of tools, lie limp on his knees. Opposite him, behind a massive oak desk, sits an interrogator, a figure woven from shadows and cigarette smoke. He asks the same question for the 5th time, his voice monotonous, devoid of any emotion, which makes it all the more terrifying. He asks about a night a year ago, about transport number 44, about the train that carried a special cargo east and lost part of that cargo somewhere in the forests between Radom and Kielce. Hans is silent. His eyes look through the interrogator, through the walls of this room, into that very night that burned his soul to ashes. Nearby, in the next room, he hears muffled sounds. He knows they are interrogating his fireman, young Klaus Richter. Sometimes the sounds escalate into a choked scream that cuts off as suddenly as it began. And every one of those screams pierces Hans's heart like a red-hot nail. The interrogator notices the twitch in his cheek. He takes a satisfied drag from his cigarette, blowing a ring of smoke. He is sure the old man will break. They all break. It's just a matter of time, and the right combination of pain and fear. But Hans is not just an old man. He is the keeper of a secret heavier than any steam boiler. He stares at an invisible point and relives it all from the beginning. But to understand how an experienced German engineer and his green fireman turned into silent martyrs in a Gestapo cellar, we must go back almost a year and a half to that August day in 1943, when their world, so predictable and orderly like a train schedule, derailed and plunged into an abyss. August 1943. A depot on the outskirts of Warsaw. The day was saturated with the smell of scorching metal, coal dust, and cheap tobacco. The sun melted the steel sides of the locomotives, turning them into the backs of prehistoric beasts resting after a long night. 56-year-old Hans Wagner, a senior engineer with 30 years of experience, was a part of this world. He knew every bolt, every valve of his Class 52 steam locomotive, which he affectionately called Bertha. To him, this locomotive was not just a machine, but a living creature with its own character, its own whims, and its own soul. Hans was a man of the old school, quiet, meticulous, a believer in order and discipline. To him, the war was just a disruption of the schedule, an annoying inconvenience that forced him to drive trains with blacked-out lights and flinch at every suspicious sound. He transported tanks to the Eastern Front, the wounded to the West, provisions and ammunition in both directions. He was a cog in the vast war machine, but a cog who took pride in his work and didn't ask unnecessary questions. His world was simple. There was an order, a locomotive, and a track. His young fireman, 22-year-old Klaus Richter, was his complete opposite. Enthusiastic, a dreamer, he had joined the railway to avoid the trenches of Stalingrad. He had not yet been steeped in the cynicism of war. He saw romance, power, and beauty in the steam engines. Klaus idolized Hans, hanging on his every word, trying to imitate his unflappable demeanor. On that day, they had just returned from a long run, hauling a train of coal from Silesia. They were dirty, exhausted, dreaming of a mug of cold beer and a few hours of sleep. Hans, as usual, was meticulously inspecting his Bertha, checking the axle boxes, tightening bolts, while Klaus was already anticipating a meeting with his fiancée, a Polish girl named Anna who worked in a nearby laundry. He took a small wooden bird he had carved for her on the journey from his pocket. He believed the war would soon be over, and they would move somewhere to Bavaria, where he had a small house in the mountains. But their plans were not to be. The dispatcher, a man with a tired, gray face, approached them and handed Hans a new waybill. It was strange. Usually after such a long haul, they were given at least a day's rest. Hans slowly wiped his hands with a rag and took the paper. In the cargo column, a blurred word was written. Sonderzug. Special train. In the destination column was a little-known station. Auschwitz. Hans frowned. He had heard the name. Dark rumors circulated among the railwaymen about this place, but no one knew anything specific. They said it was a huge camp for prisoners of war or some secret factory. The dispatcher, noticing his look, averted his eyes. He muttered that the order was from Berlin, urgent, and that the train security detail would be special from the SS. That was the second alarm bell. SS soldiers never escorted ordinary cargo. Their presence meant it was a matter of state importance. Klaus, noticing the tension, came closer. "What is it, Herr Wagner?" he asked. Hans silently handed him the sheet. Klaus scanned the lines and smiled carelessly. "Auschwitz. We're probably taking new workers to a factory. More factories, a quicker victory, right?" Hans said nothing. He looked at his locomotive, and for the first time, it seemed to him not a kind, powerful creature, but a blind steel beast, ready to carry anything, anywhere, without distinction. A cold, sticky premonition stirred in his soul, like the one he felt as a child when he got lost in a dark forest. He didn't know it yet, but that forest would now haunt him for the rest of his life, and he had already taken the first step into its darkest depths. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in bloody red hues, their Bertha was slowly guided to a siding on the edge of the city, next to a barbed wire enclosed area of a transit ghetto. What they saw made even the unflappable Hans freeze. A long train of 40 freight cars stood along the tracks. These were not ordinary wagons, but old, shabby teplushkas, cattle cars. Nothing could be seen through the narrow, barred windows just under the roof, but a strange, barely perceptible hum emanated from them, like the buzzing of a disturbed beehive. Around the train, legs apart, stood soldiers in black SS uniforms with submachine guns at the ready. Their faces were impenetrable, and the German shepherds on their leashes growled softly, twitching their ears. In command was a young, smug Obersturmführer named Schneider. He approached Hans and with a casual salute, handed him a sealed packet of instructions. His gaze was as cold and empty as the barrel of his pistol. "Your job," he clipped, "is to drive this train without any unscheduled stops. Speed, no more than 60 kilometers per hour, about 37 mip. Any deviation from the route or schedule will be treated as sabotage. Understood?" Hans nodded, feeling a chill run down his spine. He took the packet. The wax seal bore an eagle and a swastika. Klaus, standing beside him, watched everything with wide eyes. The romance of the railways was evaporating before him, replaced by something sinister and incomprehensible. When they coupled the locomotive to the first car, there was a sharp, clanging sound that seemed to strike a nerve. And at that moment, the first distinct sound came from the car. It was not a hum. It was the cry of a child. A thin, desperate, piercing cry. Klaus flinched and looked at Hans. "Herr Wagner. There. Are there children in there?" Hans pressed his lips together. He opened the firebox and the hot flames momentarily illuminated his face, making his wrinkles deeper and his eyes darker. He said nothing, but his silence was louder than any scream. The catastrophe was not sudden. It did not crash down on them with a roar and a screech of metal. It crept into their souls slowly, like a poisonous gas, seeping through the cracks of their calm, orderly lives. With every new sound from the wagons, with every new order from the SS officer, with every meter of track that brought them closer to that damned Auschwitz, they realized more and more clearly that they had become part of something monstrous. This was not just a train. It was a hermetically sealed conveyor of death, and they, Hans Wagner and Klaus Richter, were its engineers. They were driving a train to hell. And in that moment, when the first jolt went through the train and the 40 cars slowly began to move, carrying thousands of unseen lives into the unknown, their own lives also ended. They didn't know it yet, But their old world, with its simple rules and clear duties, was left behind on that dark platform, guarded by men in black uniforms. Ahead lay only hundreds of kilometers of steel rails stretching into the night, and the realization that they themselves, with their own hands, were driving this train. The first few hours of the journey passed in a heavy silence, broken only by the rhythmic click of the wheels and the heavy breathing of the locomotive. Hans drove the engine with mechanical precision, his gaze fixed on the pressure gauges and signals, as if trying to hide in his familiar routine from the thoughts swarming in his head. Klaus, pale and gaunt, silently shoveled coal into the firebox. The hot flames snatched his frightened face from the darkness. Every time he opened the door, he felt as if he were looking into the very mouth of hell. But the real hell was behind them, in 40 cattle cars. At first, the sounds were indistinct. A dull hum, isolated cries, weeping. But as the train gained speed and moved away from the city, they became clearer. It was a chorus of human suffering. They heard women sobbing, children crying, "Mama!" men's curses and prayers in different languages. Sometimes someone would start desperately pounding on the wall of the car with their fists or something hard. This rhythmic, maddening beat seemed to penetrate their very bones. Klaus was the first to break. He dropped the shovel and the coal scattered across the floor with a crash. He leaned against the cabin wall, covering his ears with his hands. "I can't, Herr Wagner. I can't listen to this. Who are these people? Where are we taking them?" His voice trembled. Hans, without turning, answered dryly and sharply, "Do your job, Richter, and don't ask questions you don't want the answers to." But he was lying. He himself wanted to know the answer, and at the same time, he feared it. He remembered the rumors he'd heard at the depot about resettlement, about the final solution to the Jewish question. Before, they were just words, newspaper headlines, a distant noise that didn't concern him. Now that noise had become thousands of voices screaming for help right behind his back. He was not just a witness. He was an accomplice. His hands were on the controls. His skill and experience were guiding this train to its destination. He could feel the train lurch and groan on the turns, and he imagined the exhausted bodies falling onto each other in the darkness. Hunger, thirst, lack of air. In these cars designed for 8 horses or 40 soldiers, there were now 100 or even 150 people crammed together. Men, women, the elderly, children, all together. Without water, without food, without a toilet. Just living cargo. During one of the short technical stops to take on water, Obersturmführer Schneider looked into their cabin. He smelled of schnapps and self-satisfaction. "Making good time," he said, surveying the cabin. "The main thing is that the cargo doesn't spoil ahead of time. They're always so much trouble, too delicate." He smirked, and that smirk exposed the full abyss of what was happening. He didn't consider them people. It was just cargo. Klaus looked at him with horror and disgust. He wanted to say something, to shout something, but the words stuck in his throat. Fear paralyzed him. After the SS officer left, the tension in the cabin became unbearable. The silence was crushing, and the sounds from the cars seemed to grow louder. Klaus turned to Hans again, his voice now a quiet, pleading whisper. "We have to do something. We can't just take them to their deaths." Hans turned sharply. His face was like a stone mask, but his eyes held such torment that Klaus recoiled. "Do something? What do you suggest we do, boy? Stop the train? They'll shoot us on the spot, and another engineer will take over. It won't change a thing." "But we can't be executioners," Klaus yelled. The word hung in the air, heavy and terrible. Executioners. Hans turned away and stared again at the rails rushing forward. But now he didn't see the steel track. He saw a road paved with bodies, and he was the one driving his train along it. That night, he understood. It was pointless to hope for salvation from the outside. No one would come. No one would help. If there was any chance to change things, it was here, in this cramped, sweltering cabin. But that required something more than courage. It required an idea. A mad, desperate, suicidal idea. And until he found one, all they could do was their job and listen as a whole world slowly died behind their backs. Night fell upon the land, covering it with a black velvet shroud. The train moved through the dense Polish forests, the beam of its headlamp snatching only the trunks of trees from the darkness, like silent witnesses to their crime. It was hot in the cabin from the firebox and cold from fear. The screams and moans from the cars did not subside. They became a monotonous, heart-wrenching soundtrack to their journey. Klaus worked like an automaton, his movements sharp and feverish. He spoke no more, as if afraid that if he opened his mouth, a scream of horror would escape that would never end. He thought of Anna. What would she say if she knew what he was doing? He, who couldn't even harm a fly, was now transporting thousands of people to their deaths. Hans, in contrast, was outwardly calm. He drove the train steadily and confidently, as he had done his whole life. But a fierce battle raged within him. Klaus's word, executioners, was stuck in his mind like a piece of shrapnel. He had always been proud of his profession, his skill, his precision. He was a creator, someone who connected cities and people. Now he had become a carrier of death. His mastery, his knowledge of the machine, everything he had dedicated his life to, now served evil. He remembered his father, also a railwayman, who had taught him that an engineer has a sacred duty to deliver both cargo and passengers safely. And now, who were his passengers? And what would happen to them at the end of the line? He tried to find an excuse for himself. He was just following orders. He was a small man. Nothing depended on him. But these thoughts crumbled to dust under the assault of a reality that screamed, moaned, and begged for help behind his back. He looked at Klaus. The boy was on the verge of a breakdown. A little more, and he would either throw himself under the wheels or attack the guards. And then they would both be shot like dogs. That couldn't be allowed to happen. Not because Hans feared death. At his age, he no longer clung to life so tightly. But their deaths would solve nothing. The train would just wait for an hour and then move on. There had to be another way. And then, in the depths of his despair, an idea began to form. Daring, almost insane, but the only one possible. He was an engineer. He knew this locomotive like the back of his hand. He knew its strengths and its weaknesses. This machine, this steel beast that was now their prison and an instrument of murder, could become their weapon. A weapon of sabotage. He went over to Klaus and put a hand on his shoulder. The young man flinched. "Listen to me, son," Hans said in a quiet but firm voice. "You're right. We can't be executioners, but we can't just die either. We have to act smart." Klaus looked up at him, his eyes full of tears and confusion. But how? What can we do? And then Hans began to speak. He spoke of the steam injector that could be clogged, of the braking system where an air leak could be created, of an axle box bearing that could be overheated to fake a malfunction. He spoke of things that for Klaus had once been just part of the routine, but now they took on a new, life-saving meaning. Every part of the locomotive in his story turned into a potential weapon. This was their first victory, a victory over their own fear and helplessness. They didn't know if their plan would work. They didn't know if they would survive. But at that moment, in the sweltering cabin of a death train hurtling through the night, hope was born. As fragile as a butterfly's wing, but as stubborn as the steam bursting from a boiler. They were no longer just executors. They were conspirators. Their unexpected weapon was not a rifle or a grenade, but knowledge, a deep, intimate knowledge of their machine. They decided to turn an element of the system into a tool for its destruction. Their hell was to become their salvation. The plan was simple and yet incredibly risky. They had to stage a major locomotive failure, not just any breakdown, but one that would require time to fix and possibly a call for a repair crew. And it had to be done in the right place, at night, in a remote forest, as far as possible from any towns or stations. Now that they had a purpose, the atmosphere in the cabin changed. The fear didn't disappear, but it ceased to be paralyzing. It transformed into a cold, ringing energy that made their minds work with feverish speed. Hans and Klaus were no longer teacher and student. They were two conspirators, two soldiers in their own secret war against the entire world. They began to create their empire, their system within the system. Their language became subtle nods, brief glances, and coded gestures. When Klaus picked up a hammer, it could mean one thing. When Hans whistled in a certain way while checking the pressure, it was a signal for another action. The locomotive cabin became the headquarters of their tiny resistance. They drew up a clear plan of action. First, they had to choose a suitable location. Hans knew this railway line like the back of his hand. He remembered every curve, every incline and descent. He chose a stretch of track about 150 kilometers, roughly 93 miles, from Warsaw. A long, straight section running through an old, dense forest where there wasn't a single village within a 20-kilometer radius, about 12.5 miles. The perfect spot. No one could see them there, and the nearest station from which help could be summoned was hours away on foot. Then they divided the roles. Hans, as the senior engineer, would negotiate with Obersturmführer Schneider. He had to be convincing, feigning annoyance and professional concern. He needed to prove to the SS officer that the breakdown was real and very serious. Klaus, meanwhile, was given the most dangerous task. While Hans distracted the guards, he would have to do what they had planned under the cover of night. He had to not only fake the breakdown, but also try to help those locked in the cars. This was the most insane part of their plan. They decided that simply stopping the train wasn't enough. They had to give people a chance to escape. But how? They didn't have keys to the locks. And then Hans remembered the toolbox. Inside was a heavy hammer, a chisel, and a small crowbar. If they could pass these tools into one of the cars, strong men inside could break open not only their own car, but possibly the adjacent ones as well. But how to pass them? The cars were locked from the outside. The only way was through the small barred window under the roof. It was almost impossible. He would have to approach the car unnoticed, get the prisoners' attention without making a sound, and pass them the heavy tools. Any guard who saw him would open fire without warning. Their life became a harsh but meaningful ritual. Every clack of the wheels brought them closer to the point of no return. Every minute was filled with tension. They hardly spoke, understanding each other without words. Klaus looked at Hans's strong, steady hands controlling the machine, and his own fear receded. He saw not just a boss, but a rock, a man who, in the very heart of hell, had found the strength not just to survive, but to fight. Hans, in turn, saw the boy changing before his eyes. The fear in his eyes was replaced by resolve. He was no longer an enthusiastic youth, but had become a man, ready to risk everything for what he believed in. Their little empire, built on knowledge, trust, and a shared hatred for what was happening, gave them not only a chance to save others' lives, but also save their own souls. They were no longer accomplices. They were saboteurs. But their growing confidence in themselves and their plan could not negate the ultimate reality, the mortal risk. And the closer they got to their chosen spot, the stronger this feeling became. It seemed as if the very air in the forest they were entering was electrified with anticipation. The giant trees stood on both sides of the tracks, like a silent army, ready to witness either their triumph or their demise. But while they were absorbed in their preparations, they didn't notice that their strange behavior, their exchanged glances and tense silence had already drawn attention. Not from the guards, no. The guards were too busy with themselves. It drew the attention of someone closer and more dangerous. An internal enemy was already awakening. As the clock hand neared midnight, the tension in the cabin reached its peak. Klaus could feel cold sweat trickling down his back, despite the heat from the firebox. His heart was pounding so hard he thought its beat could be heard even over the roar of the train. Over and over, he replayed the plan in his mind, every detail, every move. And the more he thought, the more insane and impossible the scheme seemed. What if the guards spotted him? What if the prisoners didn't understand him and raised an alarm? What if he simply couldn't reach the car window? Fear began to eat away at his resolve like rust on metal. He looked at Hans. The old engineer was as calm as a rock. He drove the train steadily, his face unreadable. And this composure, which Klaus had once admired, now began to irritate him. It seemed to him that the old man didn't care, that for him, this was some kind of game, a final adventure at the end of his life. But Klaus had something to lose. He had Anna. He had a whole life ahead of him. He didn't want to die here in this damn forest for people he didn't even know. These thoughts were poisonous, and he knew it, but he couldn't help himself. Desperation sought an outlet, and it found one in rebellion. "Herr Wagner," he began, his voice betraying him with a tremor. "I can't do it. This is madness. They'll kill us." Hans slowly turned his head. He didn't look surprised, as if he had been expecting these words. He gave Klaus a long, hard look. "It's too late to turn back now, son," he said quietly. "We're past the point of no return." "No," Klaus almost shouted. "I didn't sign up for this. I don't want to die. Let's just deliver them and that's it. We'll say we knew nothing. We were just following orders. Everyone does it." It was a cry from a soul pushed to its limit. It was the voice of the fear that lives in every person. Hans stopped him not with a shout, but with his calmness. He applied what could be called surgical cruelty. He didn't comfort or persuade him. He delivered a precise, calculated blow to the most painful spot. "Can you live like that?" he asked, just as quietly. "Can you go back to your Anna after this, look her in the eyes, and know that you took thousands like her to a slaughterhouse? Will you be able to sleep at night, hearing these screams? I can't. I'm an old man. My life is almost over, but I don't want my gravestone to read executioner. But you, boy, you have to live with this. If you lose your nerve now, you won't save your life. You will curse it. This train will keep running inside you until the day you die." The words hit Klaus harder than any physical blow. Hans had looked right into his soul and dragged out everything he had tried to hide from himself. He was right. There was nowhere to run. He could survive physically but die as a human being. Klaus lowered his head. His rebellion had been crushed not by force, but by truth. He was silent for several minutes, and in that time, a final change occurred within him. He looked up, and there was no more panic in his eyes, only a grim, cold determination. "What do I have to do?" he asked. Hans knew he had won. He had defended their small, fragile world, their conspiracy. The rebellion was quelled. They were whole again. He began to repeat the instructions, curtly and businesslike. In 10 minutes, they would enter the designated forest. The time had come. But while they were suppressing their inner enemy, they failed to notice how their real enemy, fate, was preparing its own strike. At the moment, Hans began to slowly reduce speed, preparing for the staged breakdown. A dry crack echoed from the darkness ahead, from a small hill near the tracks, and then another. And suddenly, the front window of the cabin on the left side, right in front of Hans, was covered in a web of cracks. It was a gunshot, a sniper, partisans. The shot cracked like a whip. For a moment, both Hans and Klaus froze, paralyzed by the suddenness of the attack. They weren't the target. The partisans were likely aiming for the locomotive's boiler, trying to stop the train. But the bullet had ricocheted, or the sniper had missed. It didn't matter. The fact was, their insane plan was on the verge of collapse before it had even begun. Hans instinctively ducked and yanked the brake lever. With a screech and a squeal, the train began to slow. From the guard cars behind them came alarmed shouts and sporadic gunfire towards the forest. Obersturmführer Schneider's furious voice screamed over the cabin radio, demanding a report. "Partisans!" Hans yelled into the microphone, improvising on the fly. "They're firing on the locomotive. I'm stopping the train." This was their chance. The chaos that could have destroyed them was now working in their favor. While the guards were busy with a firefight against an unseen enemy, they had precious time. The train, lurching and hissing, finally came to a halt in the middle of the dark forest, which now buzzed with the echo of gunshots. Schneider and several soldiers ran crouching to the locomotive. "What the hell did you stop for?" he roared. "Full speed ahead!" "I can't!" Hans shouted back, feigning panic. "They've damaged something! The pressure in the brake line is dropping!" "If we move now, we'll lose the brakes on the first downgrade." It was a bald-faced lie, but in the heat of battle, it sounded plausible. Schneider cursed. He knew nothing about mechanics and had to trust the engineer. "Fix it, fast! I'm giving you 15 minutes. And he and his soldiers ran off to organize a defensive perimeter, firing into the darkness. 15 minutes. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. "Klaus, now!" Hans hissed. "Get the tools. Third car. I'll distract them." He grabbed a huge wrench and an oil can and, jumping out of the cabin on the other side, began to curse loudly, banging on the wheels and creating the illusion of a repair. "Damn hole! Right through the copper pipe! Klaus, bring the oakum and clamps here." Klaus, feeling adrenaline supplanting his fear, grabbed the pre-prepared bag with the crowbar and hammer and slid like a shadow along the train, hugging the cars. The firefight was gradually dying down. The partisans, having fired a few shots, had evidently retreated, but the guards were still on alert, sweeping the forest with flashlight beams. Klaus reached the third car. He froze, listening. From inside came quiet moans and whispers. He tapped softly on the wooden siding. Inside they went silent. He then whispered the one word he knew in Polish, learned from Anna. "Pomóż." Help. A distrustful male voice answered from within. Klaus pressed his lips to a crack between the planks. "Tools. Window. Quickly." He slung the bag over his back and began to climb up the side of the car, gripping ledges and boards. It was incredibly difficult. His boots slipped, his hands trembled. Finally, he reached the small barred window. Inside, he saw several pairs of eyes gleaming in the darkness. He untied the bag and struggled to push the crowbar between the iron bars. From inside, someone's strong hands took hold of it. Then he passed the hammer. At that moment, a guard's flashlight beam swept across the car wall, coming dangerously close to him. Klaus froze, becoming a statue, pressing himself against the cold metal. His heart stopped. The beam paused a meter away from him and then moved on. He exhaled. After passing the tools, he slid down just as silently. But that was only half the job. Now he had to loosen the locks on the other cars. This was even more dangerous. The locks were in plain sight. He crept to the next car, the fourth one. He took a small chisel and hammer from his pocket, and listening for every rustle, he began to carefully chip away at the rivet on the hinge that held the padlock. Every hammer blow sounded as loud as a cannon shot to him. But in the general noise, amidst the shouts of the SS and the cracking of branches in the forest, his work was almost inaudible. He managed to loosen the hinges on 2 cars, the 4th and 5th, when he heard Hans shout, "It's done! We can go!" Klaus slipped back into the cabin a second before Schneider ran up to them again. "All set!" he demanded. "Let's go." "Patched it as best we could," Hans grumbled. "But we need to go carefully. The line could burst again." The train slowly, with a groan, started moving. Klaus, breathing heavily, collapsed into his seat. His arms and legs were shaking from the tension. They had done it. They had done everything they could. Now, all that was left was to wait and hope. They had seized their chance from fate, but the price of this victory was still unknown. The train once again fell into the monotonous rhythm of its journey. But now it was a different train. It was a train on which a rebellion had been born. The train moved on, carrying them away from the scene of their sabotage. The night seemed endless. Hans and Klaus sat in their cabin, transformed into ears. They waited, every minute, every second. An hour passed, then another. Nothing happened. The silence from the cars became even more oppressive than the previous screams. Klaus began to think it had all been for nothing, that the people in the car couldn't or didn't dare to use the tools, that they were just sitting there in the darkness, waiting resignedly for their fate. Despair began to creep up on him again, but Hans was calm. He knew that such things were not done quickly. In the car, the people first had to compose themselves, agree, and develop their own plan. They had to wait for the right moment. And that moment came when the train began to slow down for a sharp curve before a small bridge over a river. The speed dropped to 30 kilometers per hour, about 18 mm. And that's when they heard it. It was a quiet but distinct screech of metal. Then a dull thud. Hans and Klaus exchanged a glance. It had begun. They couldn't see what was happening behind them, but their imaginations painted vivid pictures. Men in the third car, using the crowbar as a lever, ripping planks from the wall. The first brave souls jumping from the moving train, risking broken legs or falling under the wheels. Then they heard the guards shouting and several gunshots. It meant the escape had been noticed. Schneider's voice burst onto the radio again, cracking with fury. "What's happening? Why is there shooting?" "I can't see anything," Hans yelled back. "Probably partisans again." The train jolted as one of the guards pulled the emergency brake. The train began to screech to a halt, but it was too late. As the train braked, precious seconds were slipping away. During that time, several more people managed to jump out of the hole in the third car, and those who had broken free ran to the fourth and fifth cars and knocked off the hinges Klaus had weakened. The doors swung open. Dozens of people, blinded by the night air after hours in darkness, began to jump out and scatter into the forest in all directions. Chaos erupted. The guards fired in all directions, but in the darkness and confusion, their shooting was ineffective. By the time the train finally stopped and the SS could organize a pursuit, the escapees had vanished. The forest had swallowed them. Hans and Klaus sat in their cabin, not daring to move. They listened to the shouts, the gunshots, the barking of dogs. They were saviors and, at the same time, witnesses to the slaughter of those who didn't manage to escape. The euphoria of their successful plan was replaced by a heavy, bitter feeling. They had saved a few dozen lives, but the other thousands were still trapped. After half an hour, everything fell silent. Schneider, pale with rage, ordered them to move on. He knew a chase in the night forest was pointless. He would come back for them later, with reinforcements. The train started moving, leaving behind the dark forest that had become a grave for some and a cradle of new life for others. They rode the rest of the way to Auschwitz in complete silence. When they arrived, it was already getting light. What they saw was more terrifying than any of their assumptions. A huge territory enclosed by several rows of barbed wire, watchtowers, and smoke from the tall chimneys of the crematoria drifting across the morning sky, spreading a sweetish, nauseating smell of burning flesh over the area. Here, their journey ended. But a new circle of hell began. They were immediately arrested and handed over to the Gestapo. The interrogations were brutal. They were beaten, starved, deprived of sleep. The investigators did not believe the story about the partisans. They sensed something was wrong. Everything was too neat. A far too convenient breakdown at the exact spot where the partisans attacked. But they had no proof. Hans and Klaus stuck to their story. They were simple engineers, victims of an attack. Hans, being more experienced, took responsibility for all the technical details. He described the non-existent breakdown so convincingly and with such expertise, using complex terminology, that even the most meticulous experts could find no flaw in his words. Klaus simply remained silent or repeated the rehearsed phrase, "I did what Herr Wagner told me to do." They were saved by the fact that Schneider, fearing a court-martial for losing his cargo, furiously supported the version of a well-planned attack by a large partisan unit. To admit that 2 railwaymen had outsmarted him would have been the end of his career. In the end, for lack of evidence, they were released. But their careers were ruined. They were banned from working on special trains and transferred to shunting duties at the depot under strict supervision. Their brotherhood, forged in that terrible night, was destroyed. Their heroic act was buried alive under tons of bureaucratic reports and false testimony. They survived, but their victory had turned into a defeat. They returned to the world, but this world would never be the same for them again. The war ended, leaving behind the ruins of cities and souls. The world tried to return to normal life, to forget the nightmares of the past. But for Hans Wagner and Klaus Richter, the war never ended. It continued to live inside them, in their memories, in their nightmares. After the war, Hans never returned to the main lines. He worked as a caretaker at the same depot where he had once been one of the best engineers. He wandered among the cooling locomotives like a ghost, a living reminder of a bygone era. Other railwaymen avoided him, considering him strange and unsociable. He rarely spoke, and only sometimes when he saw a freight train heading east, his face would momentarily contort with pain. He often thought about those who had managed to escape that night. Did they survive? Were they able to start a new life? He would never know the answer. His feat remained his secret, his curse, and his only justification. He couldn't speak of it, because to speak of sabotage meant admitting complicity in the most terrible crime of the century. And so, he remained silent. He died in 1965 from a heart attack in his small apartment overlooking the railway. He was buried in an old city cemetery, and only a few people attended his funeral. Klaus's fate was different, but no less tragic. After the war, he found his Anna. They married, and they had children. He tried to live a normal life, working as a mechanic in a car repair shop. He tried with all his might to forget that night, to erase it from his memory. But it always came back. It came to him in nightmares, where he was once again driving that train, hearing the screams from the cars. He became irritable, withdrawn, and started to drink. Anna didn't understand what was happening to him. He never told her the whole truth, only mentioning some terrible journey during the war in fragments. The experience had changed him forever. He hadn't seen evil in movies or books. He had looked it in the face. He had been a part of it. And that knowledge had poisoned his soul. He couldn't enjoy simple things like other people. He always felt like a stranger at life's party. He often left home and wandered for long periods along the railway tracks, as if searching for something he had lost there, in the Polish forests. On one such day, in 1972, he was found dead on the rails. The official cause was an accident, but those who knew him well understood that he simply couldn't carry his burden any longer. His train had finally reached its final station. As for Obersturmführer Schneider, his tracks were lost in the chaos of the war's final days. Most likely, he either died in battle or changed his name and disappeared somewhere in South America, like many other Nazi criminals. He took his version of events with him to the grave. Thus ended the story of 2 small men who, for one night, became giants. Their feat was not recorded in the annals of history. No monuments were erected for them, and no medals were awarded. Their names were not mentioned at the Nuremberg trials. They remained in the shadows, forgotten. But, as the old railwaymen in the Polish depots used to say, a legend was born on that stretch of track, between Radom and Kielce. The legend of a ghost train. Official history never learned the names of Hans Wagner and Klaus Richter. In the archives, only a dry report remains about a partisan attack on transport number 44 in August of 1943 and the escape of 68 prisoners. The incident was just one tiny, insignificant detail in the gigantic, well-oiled machine of the Holocaust. But where the official chronicle ends, the life of a legend begins. Among the Polish partisans who operated in those forests, stories of a strange attack they had never committed circulated for a long time. They were surprised when they learned that such a daring operation had been attributed to them. But they did not deny it. allowing the myth to live its own life. And among the railwaymen who worked on that line, another belief was born. It was said that sometimes at night, on that very stretch of track, one could see the ghostly light of a locomotive's headlamp and hear the click of wheels from a train that wasn't on any schedule. They said it was the souls of the engineers from that very train, seeking peace and driving their eternal route from nowhere to nowhere. This story turned into a local scary tale, a soldier's yarn told in whispers, passed from mouth to mouth. And in this legend, as in a drop of water, the entire tragedy and greatness of their act was reflected. They were forgotten as men, but their deed became immortal as a myth. This story is not just a chronicle of one act of sabotage. It is a reminder that even in the darkest night, in the very heart of a soulless system, there is always room for choice. It is a story about how even two small men, two cogs in the machine of death, can, even at the cost of their own lives and peace of mind, break it from within. Their train, which carried people to hell, did indeed go off the rails. Not literally, no. It went off the rails of predestination, off the rails of submission and complicity. And though only a few were able to get off it that night, their escape proved the most important thing. Even when all seems lost, the human spirit is capable of rebellion. The quietest, most unnoticed, but for that, no less great.